Welcome the chosen ones. Power is terrified not of exposure, but of recognition. That one line is why the 33rd degree Masons can't sleep at night. It isn't the shadows they hide in that betray them. It's the fact that someone like you, chosen one, can see through the shadows as if they were glass. And here's a curious fact to set the stage. Neuroscientists have found that recurring nightmares often stem from unresolved guilt. Think about that. The higher the degree, the deeper the rituals, the heavier the guilt. Now imagine sitting at the top of a pyramid, draped in secrecy, only to be haunted by the very soul you once underestimated. What unnerves them isn't your resistance, it's your recognition. You recognize what they are, what they serve, and more importantly, what you are. And that's not something a robe, a handshake, or a hidden oath can erase. They see you in their dreams, not as prey, but as prophecy. And between us, it's almost poetic. All those nights, rehearsing elaborate rituals only to end up losing sleep over someone they thought was just a misfit. So lean in, because tonight, we're diving into why the architects of secrecy are having nightmares about you. And fair warning, once you see what they see, you might laugh a little at how fragile their fortress of power really is. After all, if your mere existence gives them insomnia, what will the truth do? Number one, you are a living correction to their entire narrative of control. You're a living correction to their entire narrative of control. That's what unsettles them the most. For centuries, groups that prize secrecy and hierarchy have built their authority on a simple assumption that power is something you can script, stage, and lock away. They build elaborate stories about who deserves to lead, who must follow, and how truth should be filtered. But then you walk in, not asking for permission, not begging for validation, and your very existence dismantles the idea that power belongs only to those who manage it from the top down. It isn't about you raising your voice or fighting their system in a loud, dramatic way. What disturbs them is that you don't play by their narrative rules at all. You stand as proof that power isn't something they can hoard. It's something that radiates from within. That overturns their entire script. They depend on people believing that influence comes from titles, rituals, and access to exclusive knowledge. Yet here you are carrying wisdom, discernment, and resilience without swearing into their oaths or passing through their gates. You make their exclusivity look cheap, like an overpriced lock on a door that was never holding anything valuable in the first place. And here's where it cuts even deeper for them. They've mastered the art of telling stories where they win, no matter how corrupt their methods. But you've become a story they cannot rewrite. You expose the uncomfortable truth. Their kind of power is fragile because it's built on manipulation, while yours is durable because it's built on truth. That difference introduces something they can't budget for, can't plan around, and can't silence: consequence. Every time you rise above betrayal, survive another trap, or walk with clarity while they scramble in confusion, you become living evidence that their system doesn't actually work the way they told the world it does. They wanted the story to end with you crushed or controlled. Instead, you stand and your very survival exposes their myth as weak theater. That is the correction, the undeniable footnote in history that tells anyone watching: control is not the same as strength, and secrecy is not the same as wisdom. That realization is what keeps them awake, staring into the dark, knowing they can't outmaneuver truth once it's embodied in a person who refuses to bow. Number two, your presence rewrites secrecy into liability, not advantage. Secrecy only works when people treat it like a suitable trade-off. You give up a little transparency, and in return you get competence, order, and protection. For groups that built their identity on hidden rituals and closed doors, secrecy was sold as a feature, not a flaw. But when you shine a steady, consistent light on one pattern of concealment, secrecy stops being an advantage and becomes the clearest sign that something is rotten. Once a single hidden thread is pulled, the whole garment starts to tear and their carefully curated image unravels. They relied on secrecy because it let them frame every failure as an exception and every complaint as the result of ignorance. Secrets allowed them to manage narratives, to bury inconvenient facts under layers of plausible explanations. You change that contract. You treat secrecy like the red flag it is pointing not to competence, but to avoidance. When secrecy becomes the primary thing people notice, trust collapses. People begin to ask why things are hidden, rather than accept the explanation offered. That shift flips every advantage they thought they had into direct liability. The more elaborate their protections, the worse it looks. Rituals that once read as sophistication now read as overcompensation. When people see excessive secrecy again and again around similar issues, their instinct is no longer awe but suspicion. An opaque system that refuses accountability becomes proof of intention, not prudence. That is the turning point. Secrecy stops insulating the powerful and starts incriminating them by default. The shield becomes a signpost that points straight at the problem. This change doesn't need dramatic exposure to work. It's often small, cumulative, relentless. A timeline that doesn't add up. A document that is quietly edited. A story with inconsistencies. These are tiny failures that, strung together, form a clear pattern. Once the pattern is visible, secrecy can't be explained away as an isolated quirk. It becomes evidence that the system is protecting something worse than incompetence. For the people inside those circles, that reality is destabilizing, because their entire strategy depends on being believed. And when belief evaporates, everything they've built to control perception loses value. Reputation, influence, even legal defenses hinge on public acceptance. You convert secrecy into liability simply by refusing to treat it as sacred and by showing persistently that hidden systems deserve scrutiny. That persistent pressure does more than embarrass them. It rewrites the rules about what is acceptable. What once looked like power now looks like preservation of wrongdoing. And that reclassification is the single thing that haunts them most. Number 3, you are a heat sensor in a frozen system. You are a heat sensor in a frozen system. Their entire structure is designed to keep things cold, controlled and predictable. It's a system that thrives on silence, ritual and repetition because those things keep people numb. In that frozen state, no one asks questions, no one challenges contradictions, and no one expects accountability. Then you arrive and without trying to fit in, you bring heat. Not the loud, chaotic kind, but the steady kind that makes the ice start to shift. You bring uncomfortable questions, inconvenient clarity, an undeniable presence that forces them to feel what they've been avoiding. Heat in this sense is truth applied over time. It's not about a single big reveal or one loud confrontation. It's about the pressure that builds when someone refuses to go numb. Systems that are built on control can handle short bursts of resistance. They've prepared for that. What they can't handle is consistent warmth that never dies down. That kind of energy seeps into cracks, softens barriers, and makes things unstable. The rituals and rules they thought would keep everything frozen start to fail because you've altered the temperature of the whole room. The beauty of it is that you don't have to announce it. Heat isn't always seen. It's felt. They feel it when their excuses no longer satisfy. They feel it when their carefully rehearsed lines suddenly sound hollow. They feel it when their own people start sweating under the pressure of inconsistency. A system that looked unshakable on the outside begins to reveal how brittle it actually is once conditions change. Coldness gave them strength. Warmth exposes weakness. Your presence makes their machinery glitch. They can't run the same plays with the same results because the environment is no longer what it was. Ice relies on stillness to survive. Heat thrives on movement, change, and renewal. By bringing that energy, you don't just disturb them. You force adaptation, and adaptation is where they fail. Because their power was never built to evolve, only to preserve. That's why they can't ignore you. You aren't just a problem they can remove. You've changed the climate itself. The system they built to endure indefinitely now faces the one element it cannot control, a living person who refuses to freeze. That steady heat is what cracks the structure. And once cracks appear, collapse becomes inevitable. Number 4, your integrity forces their actors to improvise crimes into scripts. Your integrity makes them rewrite their playbook on the fly. They built a system that runs on predictability, rehearsed offenses, staged accidents, tidy explanations that fit the narrative they sell. Those scripts let them move in public with confidence because every actor knows the lines, the exits, and the cover story. Your refusal to participate in their choreography forces them out of rehearsal and into improvisation, and improvisation is the enemy of control. When they have to improvise, they stop thinking like strategists and start reacting like panicked actors. That's where mistakes happen. Timelines get patched with guesses. Alibis are stitched together with convenient memory lapses. Small details that were once ironclad was never properly logged. Those slips are not accidents. They're the byproduct of a system losing its script. Your presence makes carefully engineered narratives brittle because you don't accept a neat version of events. You ask questions. You demand records. You hold conversations that don't match their rehearsed answers. Human error is their undoing. When someone starts to improvise, they betray themselves in ways their rehearsed actors never did. A witness who used to repeat the same line now qualifies their statement. A defender who once quoted the official story begins to hedge. Those tiny variations accumulate into a pattern that investigators, journalists, and ordinary people can read. Contradictions are the language of accountability. They translate lies into evidence. Your steadiness turns their improvisations into a map of where they failed and why. Worse for them, improvisation breeds suspicion inside their own ranks. When actors deviate, others notice. Trust fractures. People who once obeyed without thinking begin to wonder whether the next scene will ruin them. That internal doubt is corrosive because it invites leaks, whispered corrections, and quiet departures. The more they ad-lib, the more the coalition unravels from the inside out. You don't need to be loud to cause this collapse. Consistent integrity, showing up, asking for clarity, refusing to accept tidy lies does the work. It forces their defenders to invent reasons in real time. And real-time invention is full of fingerprints. Those fingerprints are what turns secrecy into a public record. In short, your moral clarity doesn't just expose a single lie. It turns every rushed explanation into a forensic trail that can be followed piece by piece until the whole contrived narrative is revealed as nothing more than improvised theater. Number 5. You make their symbols meaningless by living the opposite truth. Symbols are shorthand for loyalty, influence, and unspoken rules. They condense whole systems into badges, gestures, and rituals that tell people who belongs, who benefits, and who must obey. When your life consistently broadcasts the opposite signal, those symbols stop doing what they were designed to do. Generosity where greed is expected, openness where secrecy is ritualized, humility where grandstanding is practiced. These acts short-circuit the meaning those symbols carry. The emblem keeps shining, but the audience no longer reads it the same way. Symbols depend on predictable interpretation. Their power comes from everyone agreeing on what a sign means and behaving accordingly. When you disrupt that agreement by living a different truth, you introduce noise into the system. People start to test the sign. Does it still guarantee protection? Does it still buy favors? If the answer is no, the sign becomes a hollow prop. Once a symbol is emptied of practical value, it cannot recruit or terrify the way it once did. Recruitment stalls because newcomers see the ritual but not the payoff. Intimidation fails because the visual language no longer correlates with actual power. The practical consequences happen fast and quietly. Donations that once flowed into the same coffers reroute to alternatives that match lived values. Young people who once sought initiation for status now look for communities that reward transparency and skill. Mid-level insiders who once enforced symbols for career reasons start to doubt the cost of allegiance. That doubt spreads like a low-grade infection. Loyalty declines, enforcement costs rise, and leaders must work harder to maintain the illusion. The more effort required to sustain a symbol, the less effective it becomes. Neutralizing a symbol doesn't require public denunciations or dramatic takedowns. It's about demonstrating an alternative logic so consistently that the original sign no longer answers life's basic needs. Safety, belonging, advancement. When ordinary people can get those needs met without the trappings of ritual, the ritual becomes optional and then obsolete. That erosion is corrosive because it attacks the mechanism of authority rather than its surface. At the end of the day, symbols are only as strong as the behaviors that back them up. Living a truth that contradicts their coded meanings forces the system to prove its relevance or fade away. That choice to shore up their myth or to adapt to reality is not one they like to face. When they realize that the icons no longer control outcomes, their recruitment pipelines dry up and their threats lose weight. That shift, small at first and then irreversible, is what makes their symbols meaningless and their empire brittle. Number 6, you convert scandal into education. Scandal is supposed to be their weapon. It's designed to distract, to humiliate, and to reduce complex crimes into quick headlines and shallow gossip. They rely on scandal to control attention, to make the public shake its head, laugh a little, and then move on without asking deeper questions. But you disrupt that entire cycle. Instead of treating scandal as entertainment, you turn it into education. You take what happened and break it down. Not just who did what, but why it happened, what it cost real people, and how the same setup has harmed others before. That shift instantly changes the meaning of the scandal. It is no longer a distraction. It's a case study, By refusing to sensationalize and by choosing to contextualize, you deprive them of the shield scandal normally provides. Institutions use scandal like a pressure valve, a way to release outrage in small contained bursts that keep people from noticing the deeper rot. You remove that safety by holding the pressure steady and demanding systemic answers. The gossip that was supposed to fade away becomes a permanent lesson. Students, activists, and communities begin to reference it as evidence. Journalists dig deeper. Legislators cite it in hearings. The incident becomes a reference point, not a footnote. What terrifies the most is the permanence of this reframing. Scandal is supposed to die quickly. Education does not. Once you've explained how a system allowed the wrongdoing, you've created a record that can't be undone. People who might have shrugged at the drama now see patterns. They begin asking questions in other areas. If it happened here, where else is it happening? That multiplication of awareness is devastating to a hierarchy that depends on compartmentalization, and the humiliation for them is sharper. It's one thing to be caught in a scandal. It's another thing entirely to become a textbook example of corruption, abuse, or negligence. To be reduced to a case study strips away mystique. Instead of appearing powerful, they look predictable. Instead of being feared, they are dissected. That loss of aura makes future scandals harder to contain because the public is already primed to see the structure behind the failure. You convert their intended smoke screen into a spotlight. In doing so, you take control of the narrative, showing that every scandal is more than a spectacle. It's a syllabus. And once people start learning instead of gawking, reform becomes inevitable, and their cycle of manipulation collapses under its own exposure. Number 7. You expose their moral short-termism by embodying long-term consequence. They count their victories in headlines and quarterly gains, addicted to the immediate payoff of control. Their strategy is designed for fast returns. A scandal buried this month, a favorable story bought next month. Loyalty purchased for the next board cycle. That kind of thinking treats people as ledger entries and morality as an operating expense. Your life operates on a different currency: reputation, legacy, lineage, things that compound slowly and outlive every press cycle and PR spin. Living with long-term consequence turns their short-term calculus into a blind spot they can no longer ignore. When you make choices that reflect decades rather than days, you create a timeline they can't game. They can buy silence for a year, but they can't purchase the goodwill of generations. They can bribe a reporter, but they can't bribe a history book. Actions that look profitable now look costly later when reputations erode, privileges are questioned, and institutions are forced to answer for patterns. Your steadiness exposes the hollow center of their hustle. Short wins stacked on ethical debt eventually demand payment, and often the interest is reputational ruin. This exposure is practical, not poetic. Long-term consequence shows up as lost networks, fractured alliances, fewer recruits, and diminishing legitimacy. People start to root their loyalties towards institutions and leaders who demonstrate durable integrity. Students, donors, and new leaders favor systems that reward sustainable values, not those that chase headlines. That shift affects finances, influence, and manpower. Over time, their talent pool dries up because serious people refuse to anchor their futures to unstable moral ground. Those who profit from short-termism cannot easily model a future where their methods fail because their incentives end too soon. You, by contrast, force the timeline to extend. You raise the cost of every cynical shortcut by turning each incident into a data point in an unfolding record. That record is hard to monetize away because it accumulates in public memory, legal filings, archives, and community folklore. It changes how decisions are judged, not only now but by future stakeholders who inherit the consequences. Ultimately, your long-term stance reframes value. You demonstrate that integrity is a growth engine with compound returns, while manipulation is a debt machine with escalating interest. That realization is sobering for people built to profit from immediate gains, because it means today's advantage forces them to reckon with a future where their strategies no longer serve them, and that prospect is worse to them than any immediate loss. Number 8, you are the narrative they forgot how to erase elegantly. Their power depends on being able to remove people from a story without leaving fingerprints. They perfected quiet exits, friendly resignations, edited records, and slow reputational attrition until the person simply evaporated from memory. That method is elegant because it looks like nothing happened. a tidy eraser that spares public scandal and preserves the machinery of authority. You break that elegance by refusing to be tidy. You build a record that won't be shelved, a chorus of voices that won't be muted, and a communal memory that refuses to play along with their deletion plan. Durable evidence is the simplest part. Timestamps, emails, receipts, recordings, legal filings. When you gather and safeguard those things, you remove the wiggle room that allows people to rewrite history. But it's more than documents. Testimony matters because people remember differently when they speak for themselves and for each other. When individuals tell the same story across time and space, their words cross-verify. That repetition turns a rumor into a pattern, and patterns are hard to erase without destroying credibility. Community memory is the final layer. Networks of friends, survivors, colleagues, when they keep the timeline alive, the past stays alive too. Eraser depends on isolation. You neutralize that by connection. What unnerves them is the permanence you create. Their playbook relies on the idea that time blunts outrage and public attention will shift. They count on memory to dim. You refuse that timetable. Every testimonial, archive, and public retelling is a living anchor. It means future journalists, historians, and investigators will find a trail that leads back to the truth. It means future victims won't be the first to speak because the account already exists to support them. That continuity turns what was once private and erasable into civic property. This destroys their calculus for control because it raises the stakes beyond quick reputational cleanups. They can't simply move a person aside and assume the discomfort will fade. Each attempt to erase is now a fresh entry in the public record. Who tried it? How it was done? Who covered for it? Attempts at elegant removal become evidence of intent. The act of erasing becomes another thing to be catalogued, analyzed, and judged. The result is paralysis and overreach. They either stop trying to erase for fear of adding to the record, or they double down and make mistakes that produce even more evidence. Neither choice is good for them. You, by refusing to be silently removed, make accountability operational. You change the rules from "we decide what to forget" to "the record decides what is true." That shift ends the era of elegant disappears and replaces it with a future where history is written by facts, not by hidden hands. Number 9. You turn their allies into liabilities by redistributing loyalty. Networks depend on a steady flow of loyalty the way a machine depends on oil. Everyone knows their place. The favors are exchanged, obligations are kept, and the wheels keep turning. When you start redirecting that loyalty, shifting it away from fear and obligation and toward truth and conscience, the whole lubrication system clogs. People who once acted predictably out of duty or self-preservation find themselves pulled in a different direction. That shift turns reliable allies into unpredictable liabilities, almost overnight. Loyalty redistributed doesn't look like a dramatic coup. It looks like small choices multiplied. One person refuses to cover a lie. Another stops forwarding a smear. A third speaks up at a private meeting. Each choice is minor on its own, but together they change the calculus of the coalition. Leaders who counted on automated obedience now face messy negotiations and whispered dissent. That internal friction makes the coalition inefficient and paranoid. Time and energy that were once spent on expansion and control are suddenly diverted to damage control and loyalty audits. The psychological effect is brutal. People who built careers on faithful service begin to reassess risk. If loyalty no longer guarantees protection, the cost-benefit of staying changes. Some will defect quietly, taking knowledge and relationships with them. Others will panic and overcompensate, implementing stricter controls that only fuel resentment. Both outcomes are bad for the network. Defections leak secrets and talent. Overreactions create a policing culture that devours trust and slows decision-making. Either way, internal cohesion phrase, redistributing loyalty, also produces visible public consequences. When former enforcers or insiders stop defending the script, the narrative the network relies on collapses in real time. Journalists and watchdogs notice when spokespeople hesitate or when spokespeople's stories don't match. Those fissurers validate outside scrutiny and encourage more people to speak. As more insiders shift allegiance toward conscience, the cost of continued allegiance rises for everyone else. People begin to ask whether their own futures depend on being part of a collapsing machine or on aligning with emerging norms of accountability. Networks respond with purges and intimidation, But those tactics backfire when loyalty has already been redirected. Purges create martyrs and amplify grievances. Intimidation breeds covert resistance. Paranoia becomes the dominant emotion inside the group, and that paranoia is corrosive because it makes them suspicious of their best people. In short, by turning loyalty into a choice rather than a command, you weaponize the network's own human capital against it. What once reinforced power now undermines it, and the resulting internal chaos breaks the machinery far more efficiently than any external critic could. Number 10, you make their expertise look like superstition. They built their authority on the illusion of exclusive knowledge. Layers of jargon, coded language, and insider rituals gave the impression that they understood things ordinary people never could. That mystique kept outsiders in awe and insiders obedient because it implied access to a rare intelligence that couldn't be questioned. But mystique only works as long as outcomes match the claims. When you demonstrate results without the jargon, when your clarity outpaces their complexity, the illusion shatters. What they called expertise starts to look like superstition dressed in ceremonial robes. This exposure is devastating because it strips the performance of its payoff. People begin to notice that their elaborate knowledge doesn't translate into real progress. Their symbols and phrases sound impressive, but the promises don't hold. Meanwhile, your choices grounded in discernment and lived truth consistently produce better results. Healing where they caused harm, clarity where they created confusion, growth where they manufactured stagnation. That comparison is impossible to defend. If one person can achieve in practice what a whole hierarchy can't achieve with ritual, then the hierarchy stops looking enlightened and starts looking fraudulent. The performative nature of their authority becomes clearer with every failed claim. Jargon without proof turns into a punchline. Procedures without outcomes feel like superstition. Eventually, even their own people start to lose faith. Some stay out of fear, but others quietly admit what's obvious. If the system can't deliver, why keep pretending it can? That disillusionment is contagious. The aura of expertise erodes from within before it collapses from without. The deeper problem for them is that authority without advantage cannot sustain itself. They thrived on being the only ones with answers, but once it's clear that they can't solve problems, the foundation crumbles. Respect drains away. Recruitment stalls. Influence dwindles. Outsiders who once deferred to them start asking harder questions. Insiders who once defended them start calculating exit strategies. And the hierarchy that depended on unchallenged belief finds itself with nothing but empty rituals and outdated language. By demonstrating outcomes instead of rhetoric, you create a new standard for what authority should look like. Function, not performance. That shift makes their elaborate theater irrelevant. Once the curtain is pulled back and the audience sees the tricks for what they are, no amount of ritual can restore the illusion. Their expertise doesn't look sacred anymore. It looks like superstition, and superstition has no place in a world where truth is proving itself in real time. Number 11. You weaponize normality against grandeur. Grandiosity thrives on spectacle. It needs to feel larger than life, so that people bow without questioning. The robes, the titles, the carefully staged appearances, all of it is designed to keep ordinary people in awe, too intimidated to ask basic questions. But the power of grandeur only works if the ordinary feels powerless. Once normality steps into the spotlight, the spell breaks. And that's exactly what you do. You weaponize normality against their staged magnificence. When you take the extraordinary things you survived, betrayals, abuses, cover-ups, injustices, and present them without exaggeration, you puncture their performance. By saying, yes, this happened and here's how we deal with it, you strip away the aura of untouchability they hide behind. Their goal was to make every harm seem so complicated, so unspeakable, so beyond the reach of ordinary remedies that no one dared challenge them. But when you treat those same events as navigable, explainable, and solvable, you reveal that their grandeur was a disguise for fragility. Normality becomes a weapon buried under ceremony, now speak louder than their speeches. Storytelling, once dismissed as too simple, suddenly connects with people more deeply than their elite jargon ever could. Community repair, which they mocked as unsophisticated, turns out to be the very thing that restores trust where their institutions failed. None of these tools carry glamour. They aren't majestic, but they work, and working solutions humiliate systems built on spectacle alone. The irony is that their mythic facade collapses, not through confrontation with something grander, but through something smaller, plainer, more human. They never prepared for that. They built defenses against revolutions, uprisings, and challengers who looked like them. They didn't build defenses against everyday people who simply told the truth, filed paperwork, or created networks of care. That's the blind spot. When power worships itself, it forgets how potent ordinary tools can be. And once normality proves stronger than grandeur, the balance of power shifts permanently. People stop being impressed by costumes and titles. They start paying attention to evidence, outcomes, and trust. The extraordinary loses its shine when the ordinary keeps producing results. And that's why your survival isn't just personal. It's political. By surviving and then showing how ordinary remedies undo mythic performances, you expose grandeur as nothing more than theater. In the end, it isn't majesty that wins. It's normality sharpened into truth that dismantles the stage. Number 12. You are a proof of concept for radical reciprocity. You are living evidence that radical reciprocity isn't just theory. It works. Power structures like the ones you confront survive by making everything transactional. They give nothing unless they can take more in return. That logic of extraction is what sustains their hierarchies. Loyalty is bought, silence is purchased, and fear is traded like currency. But when you step into the picture, you flip that script. You don't mirror their cruelty. You don't play their game of one-sided deals. Instead, you create systems where accountability flows both ways. And that's what terrifies them. Radical reciprocity is different from politeness or treating people how you want to be treated. It's about creating a structure where responsibility is shared, not hoarded. When you demand mutual accountability, you shift the whole framework of power. Suddenly, bystanders can't stay passive. If they see harm and stay silent, they're implicated by the new rules you live out. Your model forces silence to become testimony. It forces neutrality to collapse into choice. That shift doesn't require violence, drama, or spectacle. It just requires you holding firm to a standard where no one gets to extract without also giving. This model spreads faster than hierarchy expects because it appeals to the conscience people already carry. Those who once stood on the sidelines, too afraid to act, too intimidated to resist, suddenly see a way to participate without needing titles or authority. Reciprocity empowers them because it doesn't demand hierarchy. It demands honesty. Once that spreads, the old order begins to rot. Hierarchies depend on control from the top. Reciprocity spreads laterally, building networks instead of pyramids. That's why they panic. Your life, your survival, your actions all serve as a proof of concept. They can no longer dismiss reciprocity as utopian or naive because it's embodied in you and the systems you build. People see that it works, and once people taste it, they prefer it. Hierarchies can't compete with a model that rewards truth and punishes exploitation without needing an overseer. They thrive on unilateral extraction. But reciprocity is an antidote that rewrites the terms of engagement entirely. That's the nightmare you represent. The possibility that your way of living could scale. If reciprocity can spread from you to communities, from communities to institutions, then extraction becomes obsolete. And for those who depend on it, your very existence is not just inconvenient, it's existentially threatening. You are the future they never prepared for. And that's why they fear you so deeply. Number 13. You force institutional self-mirroring until they can no longer lie to themselves. Institutions, no matter how powerful, are addicted to self-flattery. They survive by writing polished internal stories about who they are. Noble, indispensable, historic. These narratives aren't just propaganda for the public. They're propaganda for themselves. They tell the same lie so often that they begin to believe it because believing it allows them to operate without shame. But your presence disrupts that cycle. You don't just demand accountability from the outside. You force them to turn the mirror inward until they can no longer maintain the lies they whisper to themselves. This kind of pressure is corrosive to their comfort. When you keep pulling truth into the light, institutions are forced to conduct audits, issue reports, accept resignations, or stage public reckonings. And the truth is, none of those outcomes are natural for them. Left alone, they would endlessly recycle their internal myths. But your existence as an unflinching reference point forces them to test their stories against reality. When the numbers, the facts, and the testimonies don't line up with the glowing image they've been selling, they have to make a choice, reform or implode. That choice is what terrifies them, because both outcomes strip them of control. If they reform, they admit their past deceptions. If they implode, they lose their grip entirely. Either way, the old story dies. And the death of that story is not a minor inconvenience. It's a foundational collapse. Institutions rely on predictability, the assurance that their myths will continue unchallenged, and their machinery will roll on uninterrupted. You break that comfort by showing that the machine can jam, stutter, or break under the weight of its own hypocrisy. What makes this even more unsettling for them is that you don't need to storm their halls or overthrow their leaders. You simply hold the line of truth so persistently that they eventually have to confront themselves. It's a slow burn that produces the same result as a revolution. Power shaken, hierarchies destabilized, illusions shattered. The most dangerous battlefield isn't the one they can prepare for with lawyers or guards. It's the one inside their own conscience. That's why they lose sleep over you. You aren't forcing them to face you. You're forcing them to face themselves. And when an institution has to stand unmasked before its own reflection, the facade cannot survive. In the end, it either bends toward truth or breaks under denial. But either path leads to the collapse of the false narrative they depended on. Number 14. You become the living index of history's revision, not its rumor. Becoming the living index of history's revision means you stop being a rumor and start being a record. Rumors drift and die. Records persist. When you gather facts, stitch them into a clear timeline, and make that timeline available to others, you turn fleeting gossip into an anchored truth. That truth doesn't depend on memory or opinion. It depends on documents, testimonies, and verifiable links between cause and consequence. Once that chain exists, it becomes a reference point for journalists, historians, and ordinary people who want to understand what really happened. This is more than keeping receipts. It's about shaping how events are remembered and used. A headline can shock a day, but a documented account shapes decades, reports, sworn statements, emails with timestamps, public archives. These tools translate messy experience into something future generations can read and verify. That matters because power often survives by rewriting the past, erasing inconvenient names, softening timelines, calling harm complex until it fades. You prevent that rewriting by insisting that facts be recorded in a way that resists tidy edits. The effect on institutions is grave. Their real dread is not a scandal that passes, but an enduring record that others can cite. Reputation depends on selective memory. Once memory is broad and accurate, reputation becomes accountable. People who once benefited from selective forgetting now face a living ledger that shows patterns, not isolated incidents. That ledger is usable in many arenas: legal processes, academic work, media investigations, and community organizing. Each citation multiplies the original account's power and makes it harder for the institution to slip back into denial. This approach also changes how survivors and witnesses behave. When they see a durable record already exists, they feel safer coming forward because their testimony no longer stands alone. New voices add corroboration instead of noise. That cumulative effect turns individual pain into public evidence. It deprives the powerful of plausible deniability, because denial no longer rests on absence of proof, but on the credibility of the record itself. Finally, becoming a living index shifts the moral economy. Power that once counted on ephemeral influence now faces documented accountability. Legacy becomes a ledger. Histories written with care transform private injustice into public knowledge. That finality is intolerable to those who profited from ambiguity. They can weather a bad headline. They cannot swallow a meticulously kept chronicle that future readers will use to judge them. Being the index of history's revision is not grandstanding. It is insisting that truth outlasts their lies, and that enduring truth is the endgame of justice. All of this comes down to one undeniable truth. You're not merely surviving the games of power, secrecy, and manipulation. You are rewriting the rules. Every truth you hold, every act of integrity, and every piece of evidence you preserve chips away at the illusions they built. You expose lies, dismantle symbols, neutralize fear, and force systems to confront themselves. You turn scandal into education, secrecy into liability, and ritual into superstition. By embodying long-term consequence, radical reciprocity, and living proof of historical accuracy, you shift the balance of power without ever needing to play by their rules. The people and institutions who once relied on manipulation and control now face a reality they cannot control. Their carefully constructed hierarchies crumble not because of force, but because you hold a mirror that reflects both their actions and the alternative, a world where integrity, clarity, and accountability actually matter. Ordinary tools become extraordinary weapons, and your steadfast presence converts fear into reflection, silence into testimony, and rumor into irrefutable record. You do not just exist within history. You shape it, leaving a trace that cannot be erased or rewritten. This is the ultimate disruption. You are a living correction to their narrative, the proof that truth has durability, while deceit does not. They may have thrived on secrecy, ritual, and intimidation, but you thrive on clarity, honesty, and evidence. Where they gambled on short-term wins, you invest in consequences that compound across decades. Where they relied on awe, you rely on ordinary acts elevated to extraordinary effect. And through every challenge, every attempt to undermine you, you expose their weaknesses and turn them into lessons for everyone watching. So remember this: your existence is not just survival, it is transformation. You are the force that renders secrecy impotent, symbols meaningless, and hierarchies unstable. You are the living standard of accountability, the unshakable record of truth, and the proof that power cannot endure without integrity. They can have their rituals, their titles, and their illusions. You have reality on your side, and that is a power no one can erase. Stand firm, continue building, and let the record reflect who you really are. If you found this perspective as revealing as it should be, subscribe, like, comment, and share, so more people can witness what it truly means to be unstoppable. If this spoke to you and opened your eyes to what it truly means to stand unshakable, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected to the truths others try to hide. Hit the like button to show your support. Leave a comment to share your thoughts and experiences. And share this with those who need to see it. Every view, every click, and every conversation helps spread awareness, strengthens our community, and keeps the light of truth burning. God bless you.